Hey World History, this is your second of two lectures involving the Age of Exploration. Our first lecture looked at what was going on in Europe to make this age happen, to make this exploration boom occur, some of their motivations, some of the technology that made it even possible in the first place. And then today we're going to look more at the other side of things, the non-European point of view, what ended up happening in Asia and the Americas. Obviously, the Europeans are still an integral part of this, but not so much looking at it from what's happening in Europe, but what ended up happening in these other parts of the world. So let's get into it. In Asia, joint stock companies really dominated this region of the world for the most part. The joint stock companies, as we've discussed, were given power by their monarchs to do things including wage wars, make treaties, make money, create their laws that they saw best, and all in all, govern, essentially run these parts of the world as though they were extensions of their own home country. The French and the English fought for dominance over India specifically, and the Dutch and the Portuguese fought for control over the Spice Islands, which we now generally call Indonesia, but it also includes the Philippines and some other islands and lands in this area. In China, on the other hand, we actually have an explorer who was kind of a pioneer. In the early 1400s already, Zheng He led 7 different explorations or expeditions by ship and was arguably one of the first explorers, in addition to people like Magellan and Vasco da Gama. But in his explorations, he didn't really cross any oceans. He just did explorations closer to land, so maybe that's one reason why he's kind of grouped differently. But in his explorations and his discovery of some of the European goods and technology that he brought back to China, the Chinese saw those products as inferior. They thought their own were better, and so they didn't feel that extreme need to get access to Europe. During both the Ming and the Qing dynasties, they restricted European trade, and people could only trade if they had offered gifts and tributes to the emperor, and basically said something along the lines of, yes, we recognize that you are superior, but we would still like to trade with you. And if the traders weren't willing to do that, then the emperor would not allow them trading privileges in China. Eventually, the Chinese started to restrict European trade more and more and more, and became isolationist, which means that they really didn't interact too much with other countries. And in the long run, this hurts Chinese growth. And we'll see that as we continue to study world history. In Japan, we also saw an interesting take on exploration and trade. And that is that Japan welcomed European trade at first, and they were interested in the products and they were interested in the exchange of goods. But then the shoguns who were ruling at this time became more and more guarded and hostile towards foreigners when they saw certain things happen, such as Spain taking over the Philippines. They started to realize that the Europeans were not simply looking for trade partners anymore. They were looking to establish control over land. And so by 1632, Japan had barred all European trade, so no Europeans were allowed to trade in Japan at all, and it even went so far as they forbid citizens from traveling abroad as well. Japan, in contrast to China, remained isolated as well for over 200 years, only they flourished. Next, let's shift over to the Americas, and before you worry about what to write down, let's look at this map. As you can see, the Americas start to be taken over by all sorts of different powers, and if you look at what those powers are, they are all different European powers. And you might even be able to pick up on which one dominates, and that is Spain. Spain, amongst several others, becomes one of the world's superpowers at this time. That means that they seem to have wealth, power, weapons, and they are able to use that power to dominate colonialization in the Americas. And so that's what we're going to focus on first. In Central and South America, they were mostly Spanish-controlled areas. Spain sent over conquistadors, which are Spanish soldiers / explorers, and they were sent over to the Americas to trade and spread Catholicism and, of course, just explore new land. The first was Cortez, and then inspired by Cortez was Pizarro. And there are extensive stories to go behind both of these conquistadors, but we're going to just summarize. Both Cortez and Pizarro took control of the capital cities of the Aztecs and the Incas. They captured both of their leaders, and for a series of different reasons, they killed both of their leaders. Well, if you take over a civilization's capital and you capture and kill their leaders, you have a pretty good shot at bringing down that civilization as a whole. And that's exactly what happened. So Cortez ended up conquering the Aztecs, and Pizarro ended up conquering the Incas. This is extremely monumental because these were no small tribes of people. These were large, flourishing, successful civilizations brought down by these conquistadors and the other Europeans that followed. The Spanish Empire continued to dominate the Central and South American civilizations, both politically, socially, but most importantly for our discussion here, economically speaking. They set up several systems and rules, I guess you could say, to make this happen. First of all, they said that their colonies could only buy and sell Spanish goods. It's a pretty strong way to dominate the economic market. They also set up the encomienda system. I hope I'm close to pronouncing that right. And conquistadors, or this was a system where the Spanish monarchs, so the people in control in Spain, actually allowed their conquistadors and other Spanish settlers certain plots of land, and then they gave them the right to expect the labor of the natives on that land. So meaning, if you think back to like feudalism and being serfs and lords, basically what they were trying to set up was a system where, yes, the Spanish settlers were in control, but then the native people would be protected on that land, they would be given jobs, they would be provided religion, in other words, forced to accept religion, and in exchange, then the conquistadors and settlers would get their labor, their work on their plantations. The main focus was on growing cash crops, so very profitable crops, things like sugarcane and raising cattle on plantations, which would be very, very large farms, which is why they needed so much labor. But as we've covered before, this colonization by the Europeans really created the Great Dying. And this is a period of time, the same period of time we're talking about, where due to exposure to so many European diseases and due to the resulting violence from the European settlers, most, 90% of the Native American population at this time died. And while this is tragic, the Europeans seemed less concerned about that and more concerned with where they were going to find more workers. And that's where their focus turned to Africa. Brings us to the Atlantic slave trade. I will also be referring to this as the transatlantic slave trade and the triangle trade, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So how did it work? Well, the Europeans are the ones that wanted the slaves in the first place. They wanted cheap labor so they could keep maximizing their profits while they grew or developed their cash crops. So African rulers or merchants who wanted to be involved in the slave trade typically would go after people that they had rivalries with or wars with in the first place, and so they would make contracts with the European slave traders to sell these captured Africans into slavery. Most of the time this occurred within West Africa because the Europeans were not allowed to go inland and grab slaves themselves, so they had to buy or sell them from the African slave traders. The European countries that were most involved were the Portuguese, British, French, Spanish, and Dutch. The reason that should all make sense to you at this point is that those are the same major 5 European players in the colonialization and exploration of these other parts of the world. Typically, slaves would be exchanged for guns, gold, and other manufactured goods. The huge advantage from the European point of view is that the lifelong hereditary nature of slavery guaranteed generations of free labor. So if you don't know what I mean by that, for something to be hereditary, it means it's passed down. So not only do you get a slave for their life, but then if they reproduce and have children of their own, that contract extends to their children as well. So you have this constant flow of labor, this constant uninterrupted flow of labor. If you bought a slave once, you would be set, so to speak, for quite a long time. As I said, sorry, this is a repeat here on that bullet point, but most of the slaves were traded and came from West Africa. 12.5 million of them in total were shipped overseas to the Americas, and there are estimates that roughly 20% of them did not make it because of the arduous journey and brutal journey of the Middle Passage, which I will get on to the next slide. Roughly 42% of the slaves went to the Caribbean area, 38% went to Brazil, and 5% went to North America. You might be asking yourself, then why is it so more well known in North America than these other parts of the world? Mostly because in North America it lasted the longest. So even though this initial journey of slaves might have percentage-wise spread out to different parts of the Americas, it became the largest population in North America as time goes on. So this map gives you a little taste of what I was talking about in terms of most of the slave trading coming from West Africa. I believe the largest percentage of slaves actually came from Angola. And then, as I mentioned, they would be shipped to places like Brazil, the West Indies, and then, of course, into the United States. And you can take a look at all of the different, not percentages, but the populations and sent to the different parts of the world. And remember, people are being traded just like the crops, which kind of gives you another reminder of how human life was valued no differently than trading something like rice or coffee. The Atlantic slave trade, also known as the transatlantic slave trade, was also known as the triangle. I keep saying that weird, triangle trade. And that is because it seemed to develop this connection between three continents, arguably four. But you can see sort of a triangle that developed. So the slaves would be captured and sold in Africa. They would be sent over to the Americas, both South and North America, where they would be used to grow the cash crops, and then that material would be sent over to Europe, where more manufactured goods would come of it, and then those goods would be used to buy the slaves in Africa. And so we have this continuous cycle that perpetuated slavery for hundreds of years. So let's put that in writing here. So the triangle trade is what I just described there. And the pattern is that first traders, well, I shouldn't say first, but at some point, because it was a triangle and it just kind of kept going. It was a cycle, so it kept going no matter where we start in this path. But first, traders would transport slaves to the Americas. Okay, so European traders would go down to West Africa. The West Africans would contract with the traders to sell these slaves, and they would be sent to the Americas. Then, once in the Americas, the slaves would labor to make the raw materials, the cotton, the sugar, the coffee, and so on. And then those materials would be shipped back to Europe, where they would make manufactured goods. So they'd make finished products of them. And then those finished goods would be sold back to those African slave traders for more slaves, and then it would cycle back. So you might even want to put in a little circle around this, or maybe some arrows going back and forth, so you realize that this was a vicious cycle that took generations to stop. The Middle Passage was the name given to the voyages of African slaves to the Americas. And arguably, I should probably change how that's worded. It makes it sound like they were doing it by choice. No, not at all. It was the journey they were forced to take by the traders who crammed them onto ships full of disease and bad conditions, and treated them with extreme cruelty and brutality, so much so that nearly 20% of the slaves that were being transported this way died along the way. The effect of, because remember, we are studying this from a world history perspective, not just an American perspective, but the effect on Africa was disastrous. It drastically changed Africa in ways that probably can be traced to conditions that are still occurring today. First of all, before this time, Africa was part of, I guess, quote unquote, normal international trade. So mutually beneficial trade, where both the Africans and the people they traded with were buying and selling goods, not so much equally, but to the benefit of both societies. And as the slave trade became so profitable for the Europeans and for the Africans in control of the slave trade, that was really the focus. And people were no longer worried about doing sort of normal trade, I guess you could say. And as millions of Africans were being taken away from Africa, this destabilized states, which means that's a fancy way of basically saying the governments of the existing civilizations in Africa started to have more and more conflicts and wars. It created economic depressions because they were losing their own labor force, and it led to wars between states in Africa. The traders, of course, kind of tying into that piece, is that the traders themselves, the slave traders, aimed to sell mostly young men and women. Not only did this mean that they were trying to aim for the healthiest Africans who would make the journey and then be strong, successful workers, but would likely be able to reproduce children to further continue the generations of slavery. And this drained the societies of Africa of their most productive people, their own workers who were likely to make the most important contributions to their African societies. They were now gone, for the generations that would have come from those same people. Needless to say, this has had a perpetual effect on Africa, and many historians even say that that's one reason why some areas of Africa are underdeveloped to this day. Depending on when it is that you're watching this lecture, we either will already have taken a deeper look into some primary sources from the slave trade, or we will do so following this lecture. As we wrap up this lecture, though, let's take a step back and look at the overall results and legacies of the Age of Exploration. First of all, Europe saw nothing but prosperity and growth, and while that sounds like a great thing, the rivalries grew between the European powers, which leads to more and more tension, which in the very long run will lead to the explosions of World War I and World War II. As we know, it led to the destruction of Native Americans and Africans, in terms of the Native Americans, almost completely so. Worldwide exchanges were on the rise in terms of goods, services, ideas, technology, and so on. And finally, imperialism and industrialization began. Imperialism being the domination of one country by the political, economic, or of the political, economic, or cultural life of another country or region. And then industrialization, I don't have defined on there, but it's basically the growth of cities and factories as Europe focuses more and more on making these new manufactured goods to maximize their profits. So, thanks for listening, and that is it for this one.